This is part one of the read-along for Unit 3.12, Late 19th Century Painting and Sculpture. European painters and sculptors in the late 19th century pushed the boundaries of visual expression. Artists who were part of the symbolist movement rejected the perceived materialism and moral bankruptcy brought about by an industrialized society. No longer content to work within the rigid confines of naturalism, realism, or impressionism, symbolists based their works on fantasy and imagination. So we're still in the 1800s, but it's the late 19th century, so the late 1800s now. And we're moving on to artists who were part of the symbolist movement. So after the Industrial Revolution, these artists felt like things had become more materialistic and morally bankrupt, meaning that society didn't have a good sense of right and wrong anymore. And they were no longer content or happy to work within the rigid confines of naturalism, realism, or impressionism. The rigid confines meaning like the strict rules. So symbolists based their works on fantasy and imagination. So they've moved away from trying to depict the real world. They're now working from their imagination and fantasy. Here we have The Scream by Edvard Munch and The Bergers of Calais by Auguste Rodin. Two examples of late 19th century painting and sculpture. Be sure to download the student PDF, the student guide PDF that will help you take notes as we move through the content. Painting and sculpture, late 19th century. Europe's Belle Époque. To celebrate the centennial of the French Revolution, Paris hosted a World's Fair in 1889. For many visitors and Parisians alike, the most breathtaking sight was the brand new Eiffel Tower, the tallest structure on Earth. The Industrial Revolution had made it possible. But beyond that, it required a special vision even to imagine on paper this graceful spire, a monumental sculpture in iron soaring almost 1,000 feet above the city. It was the perfect symbol for what the French president at the fair's dedication called the Century of Progress. So, to celebrate the centennial of the French Revolution, the centennial meaning the 100-year anniversary, Paris hosted a World's Fair in 1889. World's Fairs are sort of like a big show and tell for whoever is hosting, whatever city is hosting the World's Fair, to kind of show off all the cool things about their city. For many visitors and Parisians, or people from Paris, the most breathtaking sight was the brand new Eiffel Tower. It was the tallest structure on Earth at the time. It only came about because of the Industrial Revolution, but it also required a special vision to even imagine it. It was made of iron and stood almost 1,000 feet above the city and was the perfect symbol for what the French president called the Century of Progress. Advances in science, technology, education, and human rights during the 19th century had made Europe powerful, prosperous, and peaceful. Later generations would wistfully recall the late 1800s and early 1900s as La Belle Époque, the beautiful time. Undercurrents of gloom and strife. Yet beneath the surface of this supremely confident age lay signs of doubt. Many people wondered how long the era of growth, progress, and peace could possibly continue. Some questioned whether this newly industrialized society, with all its attendant material goods, had actually made people happier or life any more meaningful. Philosophers and psychologists wrote about alienation and the irrational, dark side of human nature. So everything's going really well in Europe, but underneath the surface, there were signs of doubt, and a lot of people were wondering, how long these really good times could continue, if industrialization and the money that came along with it and all the material goods that came along with it had actually made people happier, or if it had made their life any more meaningful. And so philosophers and psychologists started looking at that, and they started writing about alienation, meaning feelings of being alone, and the irrational dark side of human nature. Many artists rejected the new mass culture and challenged long-held assumptions about the role of art in society and its relationship to the real world. Sometimes their efforts were rejected by critics and patrons alike as out of touch with community standards. In other cases, artists' works sent shockwaves through the very fabric of Western culture. So, a lot of artists rejected the new mass culture and the traditional beliefs that people had about what art was supposed to do in society. And sometimes their efforts were rejected by critics and patrons alike. So critics being like art critics, and patrons being people who paid artists for their work. And sometimes these critics and patrons would even say that the artists were out of touch with community standards. And sometimes the artist's work sent shockwaves through the culture. So this was a time where artists were making big changes in the way they made work and the way they thought about art. Edvard Munch. Norwegian artist Edvard Munch was a complicated man who expressed his emotional struggles through deeply personal paintings and prints. Munch learned drawing fundamentals while enrolled in a technical college. He then left school to pursue an art career, first in Oslo and later in Paris, where he was imbued with Impressionist and Post-Impressionist ideals. Inspired by the work of Paul Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh, Munch used line, shape, and color to depict distorted forms filled with passion and symbolism. So, we've got Edvard Munch, and he is a troubled guy who's got a lot of emotional issues, and he deals with those emotional issues by making paintings and prints. He learned a little bit about drawing while he was at a technical college, which is sort of like a community college. And then he left school to become an artist, first in Oslo, and then later in Paris, where he was imbued or sort of soaked in Impressionist and Post-Impressionist ideals. He liked Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh, and he made his works with distorted forms, meaning sort of not realistic, sort of twisted forms filled with passion and symbolism. In 1910, Munch returned to Norway and spent the final years of his life on an isolated rural estate, unmarried and alone, surrounded by his artwork. He held deep attachments to his paintings and prints and often referred to them as his children. So, in the early part of the 1900s, he goes back to Norway from Paris, and that's where he lives out the final years of his life on an isolated rural estate, meaning out in the country. He's not living out in a city. He's not married. He lives by himself and just has his paintings, which he was very attached to and sometimes referred to as his children. The Scream. Munch's most famous work, and one of the most recognizable images in modern art, is his painting The Scream, which you can see here. In it, he illustrates a personal memory of an earlier experience that he had on an outing with two friends. Plagued by feelings of abandonment and despair, Munch painted himself as a shrieking, solitary figure standing on a bridge at sunset. So, this is a very famous painting, and it's from a memory from his own life that he had when he was out with two friends, and he felt abandoned and he felt despair, so like a deep sadness. and he painted himself as a shrieking or screaming, solitary figure, meaning alone, standing on a bridge at sunset. True to the symbolist movement, Munch used the figure in the landscape to communicate his personal feelings and ideas. Historians interpret the scream in a variety of ways. Some believe that Munch's skeletal figure, placed beneath a blood-red sky, represents man's fear of death. Another interpretation suggests the painting embodies the subconscious fears one might experience in a nightmare. Others believe that the isolated figure represents the anxiety and alienation that plague modern man in an industrialized society. What do you think the scream is about? Select the scream's meaning to read what Munch wrote about the painting. So be sure and click through that whenever you're going through the content on your own. And there's also this other resource, What is in a Name? But we're talking here about the symbolist movement and how Munch used the figure, which is the guy in the foreground in the front of the painting, and the landscape in the back to communicate his personal feelings and ideas. And historians look at this painting and they get all kinds of different meanings out of it. Some people believe that the skeletal or really skinny kind of figure with sort of a skull-like head placed beneath a blood-red sky represents man's fear of death. Some other people think that the painting shows the fears that we have that might show up in a nightmare. And others believe that since the figure is alone and isolated, it might represent the anxiety and alienation or feelings of loneliness that plague modern man in an industrialized society. So there's lots of different ways that this can be interpreted, and it's kind of up to the viewer what they think about it. Line, shape, and color. In a clear break from the past, Munch did not subscribe to the realist conventions regarding the human figure, nor did he embrace the impressionist aim of capturing a fleeting moment in time. Instead, he used expressive lines and bold, sometimes garish colors to create stylized figures and landscapes that expressed his emotional reaction to his surroundings. An admirer of Gauguin's expressively abstract style, Munch infused his own work with feeling and imagination. So, he's breaking off from the past. He doesn't want to make traditional work. And he didn't subscribe to the realist conventions regarding the human figure. Remember that the realist painters wanted to show people in their everyday lives doing everyday things, and they wanted to show them as realistically as they could. That's part of where we get the name realist. And Munch also did not embrace the impressionist aim of capturing a fleeting moment in time. So he wasn't out there trying to sort of say, I was on this bridge at this time, and this is what the light looked like, and this is sort of the impression that the scene gave to me. He wants to use expressive lines and bold, sometimes garish colors. Garish meaning kind of obnoxious, sort of like gaudy, like colors that are too much, they're too extra, to create stylized figures and landscapes that expressed his emotional reaction to his surroundings. So everything that he's doing is trying to create an emotional response and to tell you about his own emotions. He was a fan of Gauguin's expressively abstract style, and so he put into his own work his own feelings and imagination. So we start to see how he's building on the work of Gauguin, who came before him, and Gauguin built on the work of the Impressionists who came before him, and we're starting to see how these movements are all connected.